Hi, friends. Welcome back to Rapture and Chill. I'm Brooke. And first things first, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you all, and I hope everyone had a beautiful Mother's Day weekend. Obviously, I did figure out a way to get an episode in, and I'm excited about this one. I do need to correct myself, though, because in the last episode, I think I said that Timmy was a blue whale, and he was not. He was a humpback whale. And it's sad no matter what, but it's sadder that he was a humpback. Also, if you're a whale nerd, you should watch Fathom on Apple TV. It's a documentary about the scientists, lady scientists, who are working to decode or translate humpback whale songs, and it's fascinating. Moving on, I was sure that I wanted to start exploring Greek mythology in this week's episode, but it's such a broad topic that I knew I would need to narrow down a specific storyline. Otherwise, this would turn into a Greek mythology podcast because of how much information there is. That whole family tree is bananas. So, like any good scholar, I first sat down and watched a 3.5 hour documentary on Greek mythology because I was trying to find a bridge to it from everything else that we've talked about, some sort of overarching connection. And then they started talking about the Great Flood. And I knew that was it. If you recall, I've said before that God is smart enough to know that people would need information presented through many different cultures and religions. This is no exception to that. The flood, the warning, the ark, the mountain, these are all things that we see in the great flood stories, both Greek and biblical. And that's far from the only similarity. So we'll definitely cover more of those later. But today, let's flow from the primordial deep to the floodgates and find out what these resets are really all about. This is episode 5, the overarching theme, Great Floods. Okay, guys, last time we talked about the Mesopotamian primordial waters or water creation stories. Greek mythology had a very similar story, but with chaos being a vast void of space instead of water. By the way, where did we land on space being water? Because are octopuses aliens? They can open jars. Anyway, there were also stories of floods and vessels in the Mesopotamian cultures, just like in Greek mythology. But because I grew up Christian, I'm very familiar with the story of Noah and the ark. I'm sure most people at least have a general awareness of that story, but how much do we actually know about the flood that Zeus caused when he got fed up with humanity? I can only speak for myself, but what I knew about it a week ago was very surface level. Like whatever I learned in high school in that one humanities class that I had to take twice in college, that's all I knew. So we're going to dive into these floodwaters. And as we go through some of the Greek mythology, we'll draw some pretty stunning parallels to Noah's flood as well. So let's start by looking at what actually led up to it. In ancient Greek mythology, time wasn't relevant to humans the way that it is today. The quote unquote ages of man is like a concept of time on a scale of morality. It's a metallic decline. So gold, silver, bronze, eventually iron. During the Golden Age, the earliest and shiniest years when humans lived in that heavenly Garden of Eden era, people weren't really worried about time that passed because no one was getting sick or old. People just kind of died in their sleep without having to suffer, and they lived extraordinarily long lives, maturing without really aging. And that's something that we also see in the earliest generations in the Bible. People lived a very long time. Cronus, whose name literally means time, was reigning during that era where it was basically like eternal spring. Everything was always blooming and flowering and producing fruit. They had food everywhere. There was no concern about poverty or protection. This was the age of peace. The thing about Cronus is that he was a Titan, which means he was in that first generation of gods after Uranus and Gaia, or sky and earth. So he overthrew his father, Uranus, pretty brutally. And I'm so sorry because this sentence out of context is crazy, but Cronus castrated Uranus with a sickle. There's really no way to say that without it sounding insane, I guess, even with context, honestly, but that's the story. And if I'm the first person to ever tell you this next part, then I'm really sorry. The modern Bible we know is kind of vague when it refers to what Ham did to his father Noah after the flood, but in some ancient Hebrew texts, it's stated pretty explicitly that Ham castrated Noah. Yeah, that whole he saw his nakedness or whatever thing is missing some context. Anyway, back to Cronus and Uranus. Gaia actually helped set this up because of how oppressive his rule had become. First of all, six of the offspring that she had with Uranus were quote unquote monsters, not because of their actions, but just because of how they looked. They were huge and scary looking. Three of them were like the typical one eyed cyclopses, and then the other three had 50 heads and 100 arms, and they were all strong AF, which is not ideal because Uranus was super paranoid. He banished them all, apparently deep within Gaia's body, and then he kept procreating with her, but not actually letting her give birth. So she was just growing and keeping all of these offspring within her body. But she's the earth, so it's not that kind of body, but it still hurt her. So she set him up. Cronus had to remove this guy's equipment so that he would stop laying on the earth and impregnating her. Remember last time how we talked about Enlil physically separating his mother and his father? Very similar concept. Naturally, one might think, oh, how nice. Cronus is going to make things right for his mom. But one would be wrong. Cronus didn't make things right. I mean, he did release the unborn offspring that she was carrying, so they were all birthed, fully grown, by the way. But the monster siblings were forced to stay deep within Gaia or deep within the earth. Over time, Cronus eventually became just as paranoid as his father, especially after Gaia and Uranus both told him that he would eventually be overthrown by one of his own children as well. So, there is only one thing that would obviously make sense in this situation, and that would be for Cronus to swallow the kid whole every time his wife Rhea had a baby. Cronus and Rhea's children, by the way, would be the Olympians. So after he swallowed their first five kids, she gave birth to their youngest, Zeus, and tricked Cronus into swallowing a rock wrapped inside of a blanket instead of the baby. So she was able to actually hide Zeus on an island, the island of Crete, I think, so that he could grow up safely out of view of his father. But eventually, Zeus showed up, grown and powerful, and he defeated Cronus in a war of the gods, fulfilling that prophecy and forcing Cronus to regurgitate all five of the children that he'd swallowed. They were immortal, so they'd just been growing and living inside of Cronus all that time, but they were reborn in the opposite order from which they were swallowed. So, in a weird roundabout way, that made Zeus the oldest instead of the youngest. I don't make the rules. Okay, so now we're going from the Golden Age to the Silver Age. Humanity's starting to lose its luster. This would be similar to the time after Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. It was kind of all downhill after that. Zeus shortened the human lifespan and created the four seasons, which meant no more eternal spring. People had to start building shelters and worrying about staying warm and safe and fed, things that they had never had to concern themselves with before. He really threw a wrench into the vibes by changing their whole perception of time. He made it linear, so now people were stressing about the future because they were scared of getting old and dying. They were no longer prioritizing honoring the gods because they were in survival mode. How familiar does that sound to you? Because it feels pretty relevant to the current world. It's said that people in the Silver Age were like 100-year-old babies. They would live with their mothers for their whole lives, being consumed by the material world, and then they would die. Obviously, they weren't actually babies, though. What it means is that they weren't maturing. They were aging, but they weren't developing spiritually. So they would have all the power of an adult, but they never gained the wisdom or emotional intelligence that comes with growing internally. So when Zeus looked down and saw what humanity had become, he was disgusted. He saw fully grown toddlers running around being disrespectful and ungrateful and refusing to acknowledge their divine origin. Again, familiar. Zeus wasn't exactly a choir boy himself, so the morality flex is a weird take, but that's fine. As we move from the Silver Age into the Bronze Age, the vibe of humanity went from complacent and lazy to just all out bad. Imagine the days of Noah pre flood when the Bible says the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. That's probably a fair comparison for how Zeus was feeling. People were violent and hardened, and no more squishy 100-year-old babies. According to the mythology, these guys were literally made out of ash wood, which is what they used to make spears. So they were fashioned for war. They were moving out of mom's basement and just killing each other. They were a very bloodthirsty bunch. Zeus decided to take a little trip down to Earth, undercover boss style, to see if there was anyone redeemable even left. He visited a king named Lycaon, hoping to be shown hospitality, but Lycaon was apparently not the brightest star in the sky because he tried to feed Zeus human flesh to see if he was actually a god. Spoiler alert, he was. So that was a bad choice. Zeus was mad, and he turned Lycaon into a wolf, introducing us to their first version of werewolf lore, and then decided humanity was too far gone. The 100-year-old baby violence was bad enough, and the cannibal king pushed him over the edge. He needed a reset. In the Bible, we hear about God opening the windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. And Zeus didn't use only rain either. He shifted the winds and enlisted his brother Poseidon to crack the earth with his trident and bring the groundwaters up. So Prometheus, who was Cronus's nephew and Zeus's cousin, he loved humans. And when he saw the storm clouds off in the distance, he told his son Deucalion that Zeus was sending a flood and he needed to build a larnax right away. Keep in mind that this is not a big boat. A larnax is a burial chest. So there wasn't room for them to take a bunch of people and animals. God really set Noah up for success, but Zeus just kind of set Deucalion up. All he and his wife Pyrrha took with them was knowledge and enough food and water to sustain them, but they did end up floating in that chest for 9 days and nights until eventually it came to rest on top of Mount Parnassus. Yes, their vessel in the flood landed on top of a mountain. And no, it's not Mount Ararat, but it's a mountain nonetheless. And you know how Noah sent out the dove and the raven to search for land? Well, in some of the oldest, most ancient variations of the Greek story, Deucalion sent out a dove to check for land. So I have to assume that that would mean he did at least bring one animal with him. I don't know. It's not that serious. Remember, too, that when Noah walked off his ark after the flood, the very first thing he did was build an altar and burn offerings to God. And God responded with a rainbow. Well, once the water had receded enough that Deucalion and Pyrrha were able to climb out of the chest, Deucalion immediately offered a sacrifice to Zeus, who, despite having just wiped out humanity, was touched by their gesture and said that he would allow them one wish, whatever they wanted, and they asked for people. They were lonely. See, even way back then, people knew the importance of community. And now, depending on which version of the story you read, Zeus either had Hermes grant the wish or an oracle gave them the instructions. But regardless, they were told to, quote, throw the bones of your great mother behind you. Pyrrha was absolutely scandalized and refused to dig up her mom's bones. She's like, yeah, that's where I draw the line, you heathens. But they eventually figured out that the bones were Gaia's. The Earth Mother's bones were stones. So Deucalion and Pyrrha followed the instructions, tossing stones behind them as they walked, and the rocks were turning into men and women, as if they were seeds for a new round of humans to be created. When the stones would hit the mud, they would begin to melt and morph into people. So, what do you think it might mean that humans were recreated out of hardened stone? I think that's worth pondering. There's a theory that the reason we're carbon based is because the sand that we're made out of is stardust and not earth dirt. Because when stars die, they shoot carbon dust into space. And I think it'd be way cool to be made out of stardust, honestly. I could get behind that one. So Deucalion and Pyrrha were just there on top of a mountain, like, now what? The post flood world in Greek mythology is very different from what we've learned about in the Bible. When Deucalion and Pyrrha got out of the chest, there were no animals left, no trees, no bugs. It was just an empty, desolate world, which explains their loneliness. Noah got to bring his whole entire family in an actual zoo, so all they really had to do was procreate. Deucalion was a little bit lost. He was trying to figure out how he and Pyrrha were going to survive, but plot twist. Gaia actually just regenerated all the plants and animals, so I guess that solved that problem. Prometheus had given Deucalion the knowledge that he'd need to farm the land, so the new stone people would learn that skill as well, and they were all set to move forward in the new world. And without even having to go too much further, that takes us into the Stone Age, the era where human history started this time around. Now, technically, as far as we know, the Stone Age doesn't actually have anything to do with the stone people, but what if it did? What if that theme isn't a coincidence, but a synchronicity? Who's really to say? Regardless of which flood you're reading about, the message in those stories is pretty clear. The world can only take so much. There is a breaking point. Maybe that looks like a collective moment of realization or revelation for humanity, or maybe it's a gradual awakening that happens when humanity starts collectively looking for the same answers. I don't know. The only thing that I'm sure about is that when the waters start to rise, we are all in the same boat. That one might have been my favorite so far. The parallels are so striking, and I think I'm finding my groove with the storytelling. I also like getting to just chat at the end of each episode. I've been trying to keep track of the common themes of conversations that I have with friends and family throughout the week so that I can share things with you guys that might be helpful. Last week, I think we talked about control, and this past week, I found myself having multiple conversations with different people about discernment. We all feel the shift of the awakening, like that fog is dissipating or the veil is being lifted from our eyes. We're in the age of information, right? It's available everywhere that there's internet access, but as great as it is to have all of this information literally at our fingertips, it gets totally convoluted if we're not able to discern what information is true or what is important. Does the news keep you from living a fulfilled life? It shouldn't. I mean, it's bad. I'm not saying it's not bad. I see the news too, and I feel that same anger and heartbreak. But honestly, this actually kind of ties back into the conversation we had about control. Think of your nervous system as a computer. When you're being constantly flooded, pun intended, with news and facts, your system will 100% crash if you haven't figured out how to store that data that you're downloading. If you download a million things and it all goes to your desktop, it's going to be a mess, right? You have to use your logic and judgment to determine what's vital enough that you need actual desktop access to it all the time, no matter what. You know, when you were a kid and adults would say, oh, they don't listen, everything just goes in one ear and out the other ear. Well, sometimes you need to let things go in one ear and out the other ear. I'm not telling you to turn off the news forever and bury your head in the sand. That's not it. But you have to start being very intentional with what kind of information and entertainment you consume and how you let it impact your emotions. When the world is beyond crazy and all of that big stuff is out of your control, zoom out. Determine what is within your power to change. Focus on your personal and spiritual growth. In order to let go of control, you have to have faith in something. And if you're not a person who believes in God, then okay, what do you believe in? Do you at least feel a spiritual connection to nature? Perfect. Go outside, listen to the sounds of nature. You'll find what you believe in out there. God is everywhere. I really don't think that one path is right and all the rest are wrong. I think that it's like a map, and there are many roads leading to the same destination. So if you haven't found it where you've been looking, maybe you just need to look at it from a different angle. It's there regardless. Also, the UFO files are starting to trickle in, and that's wild to say out loud, but discernment is really important with those too. Do I trust the government? No. Does that mean that I'm assuming everything in the UFO files is fake? Absolutely not. If you're interested in the topic and you're looking into all these videos and witness accounts, that's okay. But keep in mind that they will never give us the whole story. And if they're claiming to give us the whole story, it is safe to assume that that is not entirely true. So just take it all at face value and then decide what you think it means, because I have no idea. I have to be open to finding out, though, because I don't think everything that was ever created is named in the Bible. And I do think that some things have been mistranslated over time. So stop looking to news sources to form your opinions and judgments. Go within yourself to find truth. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Next time, I'm thinking we're going to go back to Hinduism because I want to pop in there again and see what other parallels we can find or synchronicities. Make sure that you're following the podcast on all the things. And also, I wouldn't hate it if you shared your favorite episode with a friend. Bring more people into this awakening with you. I will see you next time. But oh my gosh, I did want to give you just one more little piece of advice before I go. Between now and next week, I just need you to rapture and chill for me, okay? Love you. Bye.